He stood in the doorway of my office with snow on his shoulders and something desperate in his eyes, and he asked me the quietest question I had ever heard. 4 words, just 4 words. And I had carried the answer to that question for 11 years without ever knowing it. If this story moves you, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another one. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in February, because that is the day everything I thought I knew about my own life turned out to be a rough draft. My name is Corey Aldman. I am 55 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia, in a narrow white house on a street lined with live oak trees that have been there longer than anyone alive can remember. The moss hangs off those trees like something that gave up trying to go anywhere and just decided to stay. I have always understood that feeling more than I would like to admit. I work as a licensed maritime heritage interpreter. That sounds more glamorous than it is. Essentially, I research the history of the ships and the people and the cargo that moved through the port of Savannah over 2 centuries, and I turn that research into educational programs. Walking tour, museum exhibit content, and the occasional documentary consultation. It is quiet, careful work. I love it the way you love a very old coat. It fits perfectly and you stopped noticing it years ago. The man I was with before Savannah, I will call him by the name I used for him in my journal, which was simply G. He would have hated that, which is part of why I liked it. G and I were together for 6 years, and we ended things the way long relationships often end, not with a door slamming, but with a door standing open for so long that the house just got cold. We were kind to each other at the end. We are still kind to each other when we speak, which is twice a year on his birthday and on mine. I moved to Savannah because a job came open, and because I needed somewhere that did not contain the memory of G on every corner. And because a colleague told me the city was beautiful and the pace was slow and the people were real. She was right on all 3 counts. I settled into a life that looked full from the outside. I had work I believed in. I had a small circle of friends. I had a ritual Saturday morning walk through Forsyth Park, and I had the oak trees, and I had the river, and I had a cat named Clementine who expressed love by sitting on whatever I was reading. What I did not have, and had not had in 9 years, was anyone who knew where I kept my second set of keys, and why I sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning and could not go back to sleep. That part of my life had simply gone quiet. I had not made a decision about it. It had not been a dramatic withdrawal from romance. It had been more like something that faded the way a radio station fades when you drive far enough away from the tower. One day you realize the signal is mostly static, and you turn it off and you keep driving. I want you to understand that because I was not lonely in a way that hurt. I was lonely in a way that had become so familiar I had stopped recognizing it as loneliness at all. I called it contentment. I called it simplicity. I called it being settled. And some of it genuinely was those things, but some of it was a door I had quietly pulled shut and stopped checking. Now, the man in the doorway, his name was Birch Sennett. And if you are wondering what kind of name Birch is for a grown man in his early 50s, I will tell you that he was born in Vermont to parents who named all 3 of their children after trees. His older sister was Maple. His younger brother was Cedar. He had spent his entire life mildly irritated by his name and simultaneously unable to imagine being called anything else. I had known Birch Sennett for 11 years. We had met at a maritime history conference in Baltimore. He was there presenting a paper on 19th century navigation charts of the Georgia coast. I was there because I had just started my career in maritime heritage work, and I wanted to absorb everything I could from people who knew more than I did. I walked into his presentation 15 minutes late because I had gotten turned around in the hotel, and the only open seat was in the front row. And I sat down directly in his sightline and spent 20 minutes trying to look like I had been there the whole time. Afterward, in the hallway, he found me. He said, "You came in late and you still asked the best question." I told him I asked a good question because I had only heard the second half of the talk, and I was trying to fill in what I had missed. He laughed at that. He laughed like someone who had not expected to laugh at anything that day. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded and warm, and it landed somewhere in my chest and did not entirely leave. We had dinner that night with a group of conference attendees. We sat at the same end of the table and talked until the restaurant asked everyone to go home. We exchanged cards. We emailed. We ran into each other at conferences twice more over the following 2 years. We kept a professional friendship that was cordial and intellectually engaging, and never crossed any lines because Birch, as he mentioned in that first dinner conversation with the ease of someone stating a well-established fact, was with someone. His partner's name was Drummond. No, that name is taken. His partner's name was Loring Vane. They had been together for 8 years. They lived in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where Birch had taken a position as the director of a maritime archive. They were, by all available evidence, settled and committed and happy. So I filed Birch Sennett neatly into the category of person who was a genuine pleasure to know professionally and personally, and who would simply never be anything more than that. And I was at peace with that filing, because the alternative was not at peace with anything. 11 years of conference emails. 11 years of occasional phone calls about overlapping research. 11 years of him forwarding me references he thought I would find useful, and me forwarding him the same. 11 years of a friendship that was real and valuable and completely comfortable. And then 9 months before that Tuesday in February, something in the picture shifted. The emails slowed. When I called, he picked up, but he was distracted in a way that felt new. Once in October, I left a message and he did not call back for 3 weeks, and when he did, he apologized 3 times in the first 2 minutes and did not explain why. I did not ask. Some things are not yours to ask about directly, but I noticed. I noticed because I had always noticed things about Birch more precisely than I noticed things about most people. That was not something I examined very closely. It was just a fact I had learned to live alongside. The way you learn to live alongside a piece of furniture that does not quite fit the room, but that you have stopped imagining removing. Then in January, 6 weeks before the Tuesday I am telling you about, he called me on a Sunday afternoon. He said that he and Loring had separated. He said it the way people say things they have practiced, quietly and evenly, with all the emotion pressed just below the surface where it could not be seen. He said it had been coming for a long time. He said they were handling it respectfully. He said Loring had moved out in December and that he was okay. I told him I was sorry. I meant it. Even when something has been coming for a long time, the arrival of it is its own specific grief. He said, I know, thank you for saying that. We talked for an hour, not about Loring, not in detail. Mostly about work, about a research project he was wrestling with, about a tour program I was redesigning. About the fact that Clementine had knocked an entire cup of coffee onto an original 19th century shipping manifest, and I had aged about 10 years in the 4 seconds it took me to determine the coffee had not reached the document. He laughed at that too, same as the first time, unguarded and warm. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Clementine came and sat on my lap. I scratched behind her ears. I did not examine what I was feeling. I just let it move through me, and I went to bed. 6 weeks later, he was standing in my office doorway with snow on his shoulders. Now, snow in Savannah is an event. It happens maybe once every several years, and it is never serious, but when it happens, the whole city treats it like a visitation. People come outside and stand in it. Children who have never seen it run in circles. The Spanish moss catches it in small, bewildered clumps. It had been snowing lightly since mid-morning, and by early afternoon, there was a thin white coat over everything. And it was genuinely beautiful in the specific way that unlikely things are beautiful. I had not known Birch was coming. He had not told me. He was in Savannah for a research consultation with a colleague at the Telfair Museums, and he had come by my office afterward without calling first, which he had never done in 11 years. And he was standing in my doorway with his coat dusted with snow, and his face carrying something I had never quite seen on it before. I stood up from my desk. He said, I should have called. I said, you're here. He walked in and I closed the door. He did not sit down right away. He stood near the window and looked out at the oak trees and the snow, and I watched him the way you watch someone when you are trying to understand what they need before they tell you. Then he turned and he said, can I ask you something? I said, of course. And he asked it, 4 words, just like I told you. He looked at me with those careful eyes and he asked the quietest question I had ever heard in my life. Is it too late? 4 words, no context, no explanation, just that. And the thing is, I knew exactly what he meant. I had known for years what he meant, even though he had never said a version of it before. I had known the way you know certain truths about yourself that you keep in a room with the light off, because it is easier not to see them clearly. I opened my mouth to answer him. And then my office phone rang. I will tell you right now that whoever was on the other end of that call had the single worst timing in the history of human communication. It was my colleague Bet. No, that name is on the list. It was my colleague Vera. No, it was my colleague Ramona. No, it was my colleague Dorinda Falk. She needed the reference number for a shipping document we had been co-archiving, and she needed it in the next 4 minutes before her appointment ended, and I was the only person who had it in my files. 4 minutes, that is all it was. But 4 minutes is a very long time when a man is standing in your office in the snow, having just asked you the question you have been quietly carrying for 11 years. I held up one finger to Birch. He nodded and looked back out the window. I found the number, gave it to Dorinda, and hung up. 41 seconds. But in those 41 seconds, something shifted in the room, and when I looked back at Birch, he had settled into a different posture, more guarded. And I could see him reconstructing the walls he had walked in without. He said, "Sorry, I shouldn't have come without calling. I don't know what that was." He picked up his coat from the chair where he had draped it. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who had been too careful for too long, that if I let him walk out that door, we would never get back to this moment. He was halfway to the door. And I said his name. "Birch," he stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his back to me, and his coat over his arm, and the winter light coming in at a low angle through the window, and I watched the slight rise and fall of his breathing. Then he turned. I said, "The answer is no." He looked at me. I said, "You asked if it's too late. The answer is no, it is not too late. And I want you to know I have never answered a question faster in my life." The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside on the street, a child was laughing in the snow. Birch stood there for a long moment. Then he set his coat back on the chair. He sat down. And he put his face in his hands, not crying, just exhaling. The way a person exhales when they have been holding something for a very long time, and someone has finally said, "It is all right to put it down." I sat in the chair across from him. We were quiet together for a while. That sounds simple, and it was also the most significant thing I had done in years. Eventually, he looked up. His eyes were bright but steady. He said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say that for about 4 years. I said, 4 years. He said, "Maybe longer." But 4 years is when I stopped being able to pretend I was only asking you about shipping manifests. I want to be honest with you here, because this story deserves honesty. We did not immediately fall into anything. We were 2 people in our early 50s with long histories and real-world complications. Birch had been out of his relationship for only 6 weeks. That is not very long. He knew that, I knew that. And I want to tell you something important about how we handled that. We talked. We talked for 2 hours in that office while the snow came down outside, and the oak trees turned slowly white. We talked about what he was carrying, and we talked about the years of careful distance, and we talked about what was real and what still needed time and space to clarify itself. He was honest with me that he was still in the early stages of grieving the end of something that had been his life for 8 years, even if it had been the right end. And I was honest with him that I did not want to be someone he reached for because he was hurting. I told him that gently but clearly. He said, "That's fair, and that's not what this is." "But I also understand why you need to know that." I said, "I'm not asking you to prove anything. I'm just asking us to be careful." He said, "I can be careful." I said, "Me too." And that is where we started, not with a rush, not with any kind of recklessness. With 2 people who were old enough to know that the best things deserve to be handled well. He stayed in Savannah for 3 more days on his research visit. We had dinner that first night at a restaurant on Bay Street that I had been going to for years. A small place where the lighting is warm and the food is honest, and the tables are far enough apart that you can actually hear each other think. We talked about his work. We talked about mine. We talked about the years in between. He told me about Loring, not in a way that was unkind or that cast blame. He said that they had grown into people who wanted different things, and that the process of recognizing that had been slow and honest and ultimately the right thing. He said Loring was a good person, and that they had ended things without cruelty. He said it with the weight of someone who had truly cared and who was truly at peace with the person they had been in the relationship, even while being at peace with its ending. I told him about G. I told him about the long, quiet years in Savannah. I told him about the radio station fading out. And he listened to that with the specific quality of attention that made me remember why I had always noticed things about Birch more precisely than most. The second day, I showed him parts of Savannah he had not seen in his previous visits. We walked along the river in the late morning. The snow was mostly gone by then, just a few stubborn patches in the shadows of the buildings. The city had returned to its usual self, that particular soft warmth that Savannah carries even in February. We walked across the Talmadge Bridge on foot because I told him the view from the top was worth it, and it was. And he stood at the railing looking out at the water and the marshes and the thin winter light, and he said, "I understand why you stayed." I said, "It keeps me honest." He said, "How so?" I said, "This city has been here a long time. It's seen everything. It doesn't let you pretend." He looked at me. He said, "Neither do you." That was not a romantic declaration. It was just the truth, said plainly, the way two people who have known each other for 11 years can say things. But it landed with a weight that I felt in the back of my sternum, and I recognized it for what it was. The third evening he was in town, we sat on my back porch after dinner. It was cold enough that I had brought out blankets, and we each had a cup of tea, and Clementine had inserted herself onto Birch's lap, with the imperiousness of a cat who believes all laps are hers by. Right. He was scratching behind her ears, and she was making the low sound of complete satisfaction. And he was smiling down at her with an expression so unguarded and warm that I had to look away for a moment. He said quietly, "What are you thinking?" I said, "That I don't want to be careful forever." He said, "Define forever." I said, "I don't know, a reasonable amount of careful." "And then I want to know what comes after careful." He looked at me over Clementine's head. He said, "I think that's exactly right." We agreed that he would go back to Charleston, that he would take the time he needed to settle into his new life there, that we would keep talking, keep being in contact, and that we would let things develop at a pace that was honest and not driven by loneliness or novelty or the particular vulnerability of a fresh ending. We agreed that what we were doing was worth doing properly. That night when I walked him to his rental car, he turned and put his arms around me, not for long. Just a genuine, held moment, the kind of embrace that is about presence rather than anything else. I felt the cold of his coat and the warmth underneath it and the fact of him, real and actual and here. He stepped back. He said, "I'll call you when I'm home." I said, "I know you will." He got in the car, and I stood on the sidewalk under the oaks and watched the taillights go around the corner. And I stood there for another minute after that, in the cold air with the moss hanging still around me, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. Not certainty. Something better than certainty. Possibility. But here is the thing I have not told you yet. Here is the thing I was sitting with on that sidewalk in the cold. 3 weeks before Birch showed up in my doorway, I had received an email from a former colleague named Petra. No, that name is taken. From a colleague named Ondine Marsh. No, Marsh is on the list. From a colleague named Ondine Frey. She was the director of a maritime heritage organization in Seattle, Washington. She had reached out to offer me a position, not just any position. The senior curatorial director, role at one of the most significant maritime heritage institutions on the West Coast. It was the kind of offer that arrives once if you are lucky in a career like mine. She needed an answer in 6 weeks. Seattle, 3,000 miles from Savannah. 3,000 miles from Charleston. I had not told Birch about the offer. I had not told anyone. I had been sitting with it alone, in the way that I had learned to sit with most large things, quietly and without a rush. But the deadline was coming, and Birch had just driven around the corner, and I was standing on a sidewalk under Spanish moss, thinking about possibility, and also thinking about a very large, very real decision that now felt more complicated than it had 3 weeks ago. This was not a small wrinkle. This was the kind of thing that tests whether two people are actually building something or only imagining it. He called when he was home, as he said he would. It was late. I was still awake, sitting in the kitchen with Clementine and a book I had not been reading and the Seattle offer open in a different tab on my laptop. We talked about small things first. The drive back, the bridge traffic near the Savannah exit, the way the city looked in the dark from the highway when you left it, all lit up and quiet. Then he said, "You seem like you're sitting next to something." I said, "That's a specific way to put it." He said, "You have this quality when something is in the room with you. You get a little more careful with your words." 11 years. He knew that about me. I had not known he had noticed. I told him about the Seattle offer. I told him all of it, the role, the institution, the timeline, the fact that I had been sitting with it alone for 3 weeks. I told him I was telling him not because I wanted him to have an opinion on what I should do, but because I had said we were going to be honest, and this was something honest. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a remarkable offer, Corey." I said, "It is." He said, "How do you feel about it?" I said, "I feel like it arrived at an interesting time." He said, "What would you do if I hadn't come to your office this week?" I thought about that. I said, "I think I'd be seriously considering it." He said, "Then you should still be seriously considering it." I said, "Birch." He said, "I mean it. Don't put that offer in a box because of something that's been 2 conversations and 1 afternoon on a bridge. That's not fair to you and it's not fair to the work you've built." I said, "You make it sound very straightforward." He said, "I'm not saying it's straightforward. I'm saying it's yours to decide. And whatever you decide, that doesn't close anything between us unless we let it." We talked for another hour about the offer, about Seattle, about what it means to be in your 50s and to still have the kind of choice in front of you that reshapes everything. There was no pressure in the conversation and no ultimatum and no drama. It was 2 grown people talking honestly about a complicated thing. That, I want you to know, was itself significant to me. The absence of drama in a complicated moment, the presence of steadiness. The following weeks had their own rhythm. Birch and I talked several times a week, sometimes for a long time, sometimes briefly. We were not performing a relationship. We were genuinely becoming one, slowly and without pretense. He told me about the adjustments of living alone again after 8 years, the quiet that was sometimes peaceful and sometimes loud with the wrong kind of silence. I told him about the Seattle decision, which I was turning over the way you turn a stone, looking at every angle of it. In April, he came back to Savannah for a weekend, not for work, just to come. He stayed in a hotel because we were still being careful, and that was the right call, and we both knew it. We spent 2 days walking this city together, and it felt different from the February visit. Lighter, more like 2 people discovering what they are rather than 2 people trying to figure out if they should be anything at all. We ate at a place on Whitaker Street where the owner knows me by name and always brings extra bread without being asked. We walked through the squares in the evening when the light goes golden and the whole city looks like it is lit from inside. We sat on a bench in Chippewa Square and watched the city go by for a while without saying anything. And that silence was comfortable in the specific way that silence is comfortable with someone you have genuinely stopped performing for. He told me about his brother Cedar, who lived in Knoxville and who was, by Birch's description, exactly what you would expect from someone named Cedar, sturdy and uncomplicated and deeply loyal. He told me about his sister Maple, who was a maritime attorney in Boston and who had apparently known for years that Birch was carrying something he was not saying. Because she had told him as much in December when everything with Loring had finally reached its honest conclusion. I said, "What did she say when she told you that?" He said, "She said, Birch, there is a man in Savannah who understands what you love about your work. And you have been finding reasons to call him about nothing for 11 years. Call him about something?" I looked at him. I said, "She said that." He said, "She also said I was a coward for waiting so long, but she said it lovingly." I said, "She sounds correct on both counts." He laughed, that laugh still unguarded. Still warm, still landing in the same place. In May, I made my decision about Seattle. I want to tell you the decision and also how I made it because the how matters more than the what. I went to Seattle for a site visit. Ondine Frey showed me the institution, the archives, the collection, the staff, the vision for where the organization was heading over the next decade. It was extraordinary. The kind of place that made me feel the way I had felt at the beginning of my career, like there was so much still to learn and contribute and build. and standing in the reading room of that archive, looking at a collection of 19th century Pacific Coast navigation records that had never been fully catalogued, I felt something clarify inside me. I flew back to Savannah. I called Birch that night. I told him what I had seen and what I felt. I told him I had made a decision. He said, "Tell me." I said, "I'm not taking it." He was quiet. Then he said, "Why?" I said, "Because Savannah is not finished with me yet, and because the reasons I am saying no have nothing to do with you and everything to do with me. I want you to know that. I have work here that is incomplete. I have a research project I started 4 years ago that deserves to be finished. I have a city that I moved to because I needed it, and that I have stopped needing in the way I did, but that I still love. And I am saying no to Seattle because when I stood in that reading room, I felt the pull of it, but I also felt clearly, for the first time in years, that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He said, "Are you sure that has nothing to do with me?" I said, "I'm sure that it has nothing to do with you being a reason for me to stay. You might be a reason I was paying closer attention to what I already had." "But that's different," he said. "That's an important distinction." I said, "I know." Then he said, "I have something to tell you too." My heart did a thing it has not done in many years. Not a dramatic thing, just a quiet, involuntary lean forward. He said, "I have been offered a visiting fellowship at the Georgia Historical Society, 6 months in Savannah starting in September. I was not going to mention it until you made your decision about Seattle because I did not want it to be a factor." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "How long have you known?" He said, 3 weeks. I said, "So we've both been sitting next to something." He said very softly, "I suppose we have." September came. The Georgia air was still warm in that particular way. Savannah holds on to summer longer than it should. And Birch arrived with 2 large bags and a very specific kind of nervousness that I recognized because I was also nervous in the same specific way. And we both understood that this was the beginning of something real, and that real things require courage even when you are old enough to know better than to pretend otherwise. He found a furnished apartment on Jones Street, 4 blocks from my house, which was close enough to be honest about what we were and far enough to give each thing its own room to breathe. The months that followed were the quietest, most ordinary, most genuinely happy period of my adult life. We had a routine. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, we met at a coffee place on Broughton Street before we each went to our respective work. Saturday mornings, I walked Forsyth Park as I always had, and after the first few weeks, Birch started joining me, and after a few more weeks, it had simply become our walk. The way things become yours when you stop noticing the transition. On Sunday evenings, he came to my house and we made dinner together, and Clementine made her preferences about Lap real estate very clearly known. We talked about everything. About the research we were each doing, about our families, about the years we had spent in our separate lives and the things we had learned in them. About the relationship he had come from, and the relationship I had come from, and what we each understood now about ourselves that we had not understood at the start of those things. There was no performance. There was no version of ourselves we were curating for each other. There was just this, 2 people in their early 50s who had spent 11 years on a long, slow approach to something true, and who had finally arrived at it. One evening in November, we were sitting on my back porch again. The air had that clear Savannah November quality, cool but not cold, with the smell of the river somewhere underneath everything. Clementine was inside, because she had decided November was not her season. The strings of lights I had hung along the fence were on, and the yard was quiet. Birch said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "You know you can." He said, "When I asked you that question in your office, in February, in the snow, and the phone rang. What were you going to say before it rang?" I said, "The same thing I said after it rang." He said, "Right away, without thinking." I said, "Birch, I had been thinking about it for 11 years. The phone ringing was the only delay there ever was." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have asked sooner." I said, "You asked when you were ready to ask." And I was ready to answer. He said, "I was afraid." I said, "I know, so was I, but we got here." He nodded. He looked out at the yard and the lights. He said, "We did." We sat there for a long time in the comfortable silence of people who have nothing left to hide from each other and know where they would rather be. The live oaks were moving slightly in the night air. The moss was still. The city was going about its ancient business around us. I thought about the question he had asked in that doorway. 4 words. All that time, and the answer had always been the same, clear and certain and waiting like a room with the light finally on. It is not too late. It is never too late for something true. By the time February came around again, a full year after the Tuesday with the snow, Birch was preparing to return to Charleston. The fellowship was ending. We had talked about this, not with anxiety, but with the practical, caring honesty that had become the ground we walked on. The distance was real. Charleston to Savannah is 2 hours by car. Not nothing, not insurmountable. We had made agreements about what the coming months would look like, and those agreements were clear and chosen and ours. On the Sunday before he left, we walked the river. The morning was cold and bright, and the light on the water was that specific February silver that I associate now, and will always associate with this whole long story. We walked without much talking, just side by side, in the comfortable rhythm of people who know each other's pace. Near the point where the river curves and you can see the bridge from below, he stopped. He looked at the water for a moment, then he looked at me. He said, "I don't have a question this time." I said, "No," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you for answering. For not letting me walk out the door." I said, "I called your name." He said, "You did." I said, "I would do it again." He took my hand. We stood there at the river's edge in the cold, bright morning, and I held on, the way you hold something you know is real and earned and good. The moss moved in the wind. The water moved toward the sea, and somewhere behind us in the city, under the oldest trees, life was going about the remarkable and ordinary business of continuing. And I want to tell you this if you are listening, and if any part of this story sounds familiar to you. If there is a question you have been carrying, if there is a door you have kept mostly shut, if there is someone whose name you say more carefully than other names, it is not too late. You already